coming. We're really happy to see you all. This event is part of a series of events organised by RS21, which is a socialist, feminist and anti-racist group in Britain. Endgames 2021 is our monthly comradely conversations exploring crucial aspects of ecosocialism today. Tonight, we'll be joined by Jonathan Neale. Jonathan is a climate activist and professional writer. From 2000 to 2004, he was one of the organisers of the European Social Forum from 2004 to 2011. Jonathan was International Secretary of the Campaign Against Climate Change in Britain, where he helped to organise global demonstrations each year. His recent book, Fight the Fire, Green New Deals and Climate Jobs, is published by Resistance Books and is available to download from the Ecologists website. So we'd encourage everyone to have a read of that if you haven't already. And without further ado, I'll pass to Jonathan to take it away. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. I feel like I'm among friends here. I think I know more than half the people in this meeting, and quite a few of you have heard me talk about these matters before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about half the talk will be directly related to my book, Fight the Fire. And I'll make the basis of the case for why we need a Green New Deal, why we need a climate job solution globally. And also say something about why the Global South is absolutely important to that. But in the second half of the talk, I'm going to think aloud in some ways about how we get from here to the kind of mass global movement that can actually change the world to save the world. Let me start with climate jobs and why they're important. Let me start with a distinction. A Green New Deal is an idea popularized by Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders in the United States and taken up in many other places. And the idea there is massive government spending to make the economy and society far more equal, and to do it with deficit spending to stimulate the economy, and to spend that money on both doing something about climate change and on the other central tasks that have to be done. So in the United States, for instance, the Green New Deal that they have proposed, the two cornerstones of it are, on the one hand, doing something about climate change, mainly renewable energy and transport, and on the other hand, health, effectively a national health service, Medicare for all, which they do not have in the United States. In Britain, in South Africa, a Green New Deal of that sort would be focused, South African climate activists say, on doing something about climate change and about doing something about housing for working class people. And giving a basic income grant so that working class people are not going to bed hungry in South Africa. In different countries, it's different. But what I'm going to talk about today is almost entirely the climate part of it and the climate jobs part of it. And I want to start by emphasizing the reason for making climate jobs central. Climate jobs is not one more part of an argument about climate where we also have to think about livestock and meat, and we have to think about how to cope with climate change. You have to, climate jobs are absolutely central, and they're central for a reason. When I, in the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, I worked in an AIDS unit, testing people for HIV and counseling people who got positive results for HIV, and counseling people who had HIV and had AIDS and were getting sicker and so on. This was before there were the drugs that aren't quite a cure, but keep people alive for decades. This was before those drugs. And I watched, as a participant, I watched what happened in global politics about AIDS. And crucially, what happened among gay men in Europe and in the United States, who were the cutting edge of the first movement about AIDS. And They started out thinking this would be about, let's not stigmatize gay men, let's defend our civil liberties, let's defend our bathhouses and so on. But quite quickly, it became instead a movement about how do we stay alive and how do we take care of the people who are dying. And in the process of doing that, answering those questions, which were the overwhelming questions about what you had to do in the world. First of all, gay men and many, many lesbians and family members of people with HIV all pitched in together to look after, to care for, and to love and to befriend people who were dying. And the people who were dying responded by dying as bravely as they possibly could, to show the other people they knew who were around them who thought they probably had HIV that they too could walk through this valley. And that was the first thing. They built a sense of love and community. On the basis of that thing, the second thing was the invention of safe sex, which was a technical, scientific solution to the problem of passing the HIV virus. But it was one that went politically deep into the history, deep into the joy of what had been gay liberation. Because what safe sex said was you can do anything you want sexually. You can have any kind of fun you want with whoever you want, as creatively as you possibly can. Really, really go for it. Just use a condom and we can all stay alive. And also, crucially, don't do this to keep yourself alive. Do this always. You're wearing a condom for the other person. And this is a community doing this. The second thing they did, because they had the community based on love and care, because they had built a mass movement with no funding whatsoever around safe sex, then they were able to build a mass movement ACT UP that forced the United States government to put fast track approval for drugs that could cope with AIDS and to make enormous amounts of money available to develop the pharmaceuticals to do it. And because of that, they got a cure. And because of what they did in that campaign, that's why we have vaccines for COVID now so fast. We have that because of what they fought for. And once that was done, then gay men in the United States and Europe had, most of them had drugs, and some drug users who were infected in that way, and some people in those countries who were in neither of those groups, they got the medicines. And people in the global south, people in the poor countries didn't get the medicines because everybody knew that these were very expensive. And of course, people in Africa were going to die, people in India were going to die, people in Brazil were going to die. That was what people in those countries were expected to do, was to die. And we didn't build a mass movement about that in the global north. And at first, people were so ashamed and so terrified of the global south that they didn't build it either. But then in South Africa, a movement started by gay men in South Africa who had been in the liberation movement against apartheid, who had been part of the movement that broke apartheid, who had created who were part and parcel of that movement. Those gay men, 6 of them really, knew that they had to, that's a lie, 10, knew that they had to build a mass movement, and that they could build a mass movement because this had been their experience. So they started to build a mass movement, which very rapidly became not a movement led by gay men with educations, but a movement overwhelmingly led by and on the streets composed of working class Black African people, especially women. And that movement forced the pharmaceutical companies to allow very, very cheap copies of the drugs, forced the government of South Africa, which did not want to supply them, forced the government of Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who wanted to stop this happening, to allow them to do so, and so on, and won not just proper treatment for AIDS for most people in South Africa, but won it for people all across Africa. And and the worst affected places. Okay, what I learned from this experience, watching this experience, is that when you're faced with catastrophe, build a mass movement. A movement that is not a movement of the political people, but is a movement of the people who are faced with this catastrophe. Build it where they have their lives, in the communities that they're in. Build it with absolute daring, and build it with the intention of actually solving this problem. So the question that you, and I learned that can be done. Now, climate change, global warming, is a problem of such a different scale from the global AIDS epidemic, which has only killed 40 million people so far, which is a terrible, terrible tragedy. But climate change is going to be much, much worse. But it is energy. Energy is part of every single bit of the global economic system. So this is an enormous challenge. But the starting point is just as it was with condoms and with viruses and with drugs. Starting point is, how do we keep people alive? We keep people alive by stopping climate change. How do we stop it? We reduce the greenhouse gas emissions going into the air. And what all the science is telling us is we have to reduce them massively. We have to reduce CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels by more than 90% globally, everywhere. And we have to reduce the other emissions from that come from largely from agriculture, but from waste as well. We have to reduce them by at least 50%. But the more than 3/4 of emissions come from burning fossil fuels. That's basically, we have to reduce those emissions. The reason for jobs is that we cannot reduce those emissions by reducing our consumption. We cannot reduce those emissions by stopping the process of growth. We need to reduce emissions by more than 90%. Nobody thinks that we can stop emissions by reducing the British economy. Nobody thinks that it's realistic to reduce the size of the British economy by 90%. That is to say, you will have not quite enough money for food, and no more money ever for housing, and no more money ever for transport, and no more new clothes, and no more new shoes, and so on and so on and so on. There's nowhere in the world that a 90% cut in the standard of living is realistic. And no degrowth person anywhere is proposing a scale of reduction on that scale. We're going to have to do it overwhelmingly by doing something else, by producing energy in a different way so that we're able to have the same activities, but with a different energy. Otherwise, we're not going to do it. What that means concretely, there are thousands of things we need to do, but the main ones, the main jobs that need to be done, are to cover the world with renewable energy so that all of the electricity produced in the world is produced with renewable energy. The main forms will be solar power and wind power, but there are quite a few different kinds I go into in some detail in the book, which back that up and which will balance those main forms of energy. We're also going to need to build enormous grids that cover great distances and that link together, grids that stretch across much of Europe, for instance, or much of North America, grids that connect different sources of renewable energy, thousands and thousands and thousands of different sources, and renew them all so that we have a steady, reliable supply. To do this, this is technically the greatest technical challenge we have faced. It is certainly, those grids will be the most beautiful and the most complex machines that humanity has ever built. The next thing we'll need to do is jobs so that everybody, all forms of ground transportation are run completely on electricity, which is produced from renewable energy. We can also, with public transport, reduce the amount of energy that we need for transport. And I'll come back to that in the discussion if you want, but the absolutely crucial thing is all of it has to be done completely on renewable energy. That leaves the problem of planes, because you can't run a plane on electricity. And the solution to that is to make most of the trips that people need to take, certainly all the trips of 5,000 miles or less, not all of them, but almost all the very long flights and so on, replace them with railway journeys powered by electricity from renewable sources. We need to change the whole of industry everywhere so that it runs, so that materials are heated with electricity from renewable energy. And we also need to ban all uses of cement, which has enormous amounts of emissions for technical reasons I could come back to. And as we know from our houses in Britain, we need to convert all of the housing in the world so that it is well insulated and it runs on electricity from renewable sources. The heating and the cooking runs on that. And all new building has to be done to a code, which means it is done in that way. And what's called passive houses uses very little energy. There are many other things that we need to do, and I'll come back to them in the book, but those are the central things we need to do. And it's very important to understand we don't need to do 75% of that. If we do 75% of that, we're lost. We need to do way more than 90%, basically, with renewable energy, except in a very small number of cases. We need to do it all with renewable energy. That's what needs to be done. And the reason we need those jobs is if we don't have those jobs, we're going to hell together. We don't know, we can't know, because I go into it in a great deal of detail, the kind of in the book, the kind of non-linear processes involved. We don't know whether we have 10 years or 20 years or 40 years or 50 years. But we do know that at a certain point, the feedbacks in the changing global energy and atmospheric system will be such that things will be moving very quickly indeed. And that our lives, not that all human beings will be destroyed, but that the scale of death will be very, very high indeed. And it will dwarf all of the horrors of the 20th century. So we have to have the jobs. And that's why we have to. It's also good that the jobs are something for unions to fight about. It's good that the jobs do something for working class people. It's good that fighting for jobs gives us something we can fight about now in order to do something about the future. But the reason we have to do the jobs is there is no political and economic system in the world that could solve this unless people do those jobs. For this problem to be solved under capitalism or under socialism or under anarchism or under fascism, however this problem is solved, it has to be solved by people doing those jobs. So that's why we're fighting.
That's your 10 minutes there.
10 minutes. That's why we're fighting for those jobs. Now, I've gone into some detail about why we're fighting for it. So what I'll do is I'll skip the next bit, but it's very important in the book, which is that this fight has to be in the global north, but even more important, it has to be in the global south. In Asia and Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, what's called the global south, the poorer countries, is where 80% of the population of the world live. It's where the majority of our species lives in the global south. That's who we basically are. More important, though, is that we have always said that in order to do something for many, many years, everybody said basically the rich industrial countries of Europe, North America, Japan have to solve this problem. That is no longer true. In 2019, 62% of carbon dioxide emissions came from the countries of the global south. This is because the countries of the global south have industrialized and they have become richer, both. And the percentage from the countries of the global south is increasing. It will soon be 67%, 2/3. In this situation, unless there are massive falls in emissions from the global south as well, we will not solve this problem. And the people who will pay for that are the people, most are the people in the global south, and the people who in the global south who will pay most are the poorest people in the global south. So from the point of view of the people in poor people in the global south, this has to be done, and it has to be done in the global south and in the global north. So we have to build a movement to do it in both places. We cannot build this movement by saying that we have to give up things, because people, working class people, Dalits in India don't think we have to give up things. They think we don't have enough. The people who have been rioting in South Africa, burning down everything they could because they're hungry, they don't think we don't have enough. They don't think we have enough, we have to give up. We can only build a movement, a global movement in the global south and in the north, but critically in the global south, by having a movement that says we will make poverty history. The climate jobs will be so that there'll be an alternative path to development, so that everybody in the world can have what they need. And this path to development will be a renewable energy pathway. And for that, again, we need the jobs. Okay, now quickly, how do we build this mass movement? Well, some of the answers I don't know. I didn't see Greta Thunberg coming. I didn't see the mass movement Shebel coming, but she saw it coming. I think pretty soon after she started sitting down outside the Swedish parliament, she saw it coming, and maybe before she even walked down there, she knew what she was doing. Great mass movements have always thrown up entirely new ways of struggle. And this, whatever happens, we are going to have a great mass movement about climate. We already have the beginnings of one. The question is, what will that movement do? What kind of power will that movement take? And can we do it in time? In this situation, we need to build a movement that looks always, this is a central thing to say today, that looks always to the question, this is what you're suffering from. What is the solution? This is what's going to happen to you, and it's what's going to happen to the next generation and the people after. This is what's going to happen to the people you love and the planet you love. What are we going to do? What do we have to do to stop this happening? And so it's a campaign for jobs, but also it's a campaign from the bottom up. We have waited now we've waited for the market to deliver, but we've waited for Obama and Joe Biden and Merkel and everybody else and the Labor Party. We waited for everybody to deliver, and they have not delivered. And not just in this one country. All over the world, the governments have not delivered. It's a structural thing. They are not going to deliver. So we have, not only that, emissions keep going up. All the time they've been saying that we must do something, it's critical we do something. All the time, emissions have been going up, the global emissions. So we have to build a movement, a global movement from below that is going to force them to do it. And we have to build a movement that starts below in every country, but is talking to each other all the time, because we're going to have to come together to force the governments to do it. This is an enormous challenge. It's very important to start though with a very simple thing, which is to talk to the people you know. Get them, if you can, to read my book. I wrote it because those are things people need to know. If you read it and you think it's useful, get them to read it. But more important, just go on about climate change, go on about jobs. But also look for in every possible situation, look for the allies. When I go through the book in detail, when I'm talking about extractivism, instead of saying lithium mining means that it's impossible because it's so toxic, it's impossible to do anything about batteries, I go into how do we build a movement of solidarity between unions working in renewable energy in Germany and France and Canada and people in Bolivia and Congo and Australia who are right next to the lithium mines and so on. How do we build these alliances? The point about jobs, it's not that we want to include unions because workers need a just transition, that's only fair. It's that we want to include unions because unions, we're going to need the working class of the world. We're going to need the majority of the working class in the world to back fighting about this. And we're going to need hundreds of millions of workers to actually fight for it. And the unions in this world do not organize the majority of working class people, but the people who are in the unions know how to get to all the working class people in their country. They know how to begin to build. That's why we need the unions. We need the unions because we cannot solve this problem without the unions. That's why we need those farmers from in India who are in Delhi, the mass demonstrations of farm. We need the farmers because we need the mass movements. So when you're talking about farming policy, what should the farming policy be? Start with those people. What farming policy do they want? How does climate change relate to them? And so on.
Just a few minutes left there.
Okay, just a few minutes. Then I think it can see, okay, the next thing is we each of us are small people. We're each of us small and unimportant and weak and a tiny force in the world. But we do have to think like Greta Thunberg thought. And the many, many, many other people in schools all over the world who looked at what Thunberg was doing and said, I'm going to try and get my classmates to do that. We have to do that because this is an enormous problem. What paralyzes people is that it is such an enormous problem. And so the answer has to be that we have to be enormously daring. We have to say to ourselves, not this is the socialist argument for doing something about climate change, and this explains why capitalism is wrong, and so on. So why don't I persuade you to be a socialist? We have to say instead, we have to stop this, you and me and all the other people like us, all the people who are going to be affected by this. We have to stop this. So our we becomes not people who are like us in their political opinions, not people who are like us in their lifestyles, not people who like us went to university or didn't or whatever. Our we becomes the people who are facing this existential crisis. And we have to think in terms of mobilizing mass movements of those people. Now, the last thing to say is that sounds mad, terrifyingly hard. But if you look around the world, since 2019, I keep a running tally, and I think there's 16 countries now. Most recently, Cuba and Iran, but more and more and more, where what you have is one form or another of an uprising since 2019. And those uprisings in Chile and India and Hong Kong and Lebanon and Iraq and Sudan and so on, and Belarus, they're characterized by several things. One is they're all for democracy, massive democracy. Where there is a dictatorship, they're always for democracy. Where there is democracy, they're always for a different kind of democracy and more democracy. They're always against inequality and against the suffering that the increasing inequality is bringing the world. Women are more important in the leaderships of these mass movements than they've ever been before. And at the grassroots, overwhelmingly, these movements are young, often very young. Often the critical people are 18 and younger. These movements reject all of the existing political parties. They have a slogan that they chant in Lebanon, the crowds chant, which says all of them means all of them. We reject all the existing political parties. Which is, if you watch what Greta Thunberg does too, she says, I mean all of you. You have all failed, all of you. And these are movements that also are learning. There's much they don't know. And there are movements that crop up everywhere. They crop up, there's the Me Too movement, which in the countries where it's strong, like the United States, Me Too is a mass movement of thousands of different workplace organizations against the boss. Black Lives Matter, which again, and the Me Too is to stop the boss raping you. The Black Lives Matter is to stop the cops killing young Black people. These are all of these movements. The movements for democracy are to get rid of the dictatorship. All of them are movements fighting for what people need. And we have to make a wager on history. We have to make a bet. We have to risk it. We have to just try. We have to say, these movements represent an underlying change in the world. And we will go with that, and we will hope that as we are part of that globally, those movements, they will change, and we will change, all of us will change in the process. And that will make it possible if we're talking all the time about, many of us are talking all the time about the solution that is necessary. It will be possible to get the jobs, which will stop the climate change happening, which will protect our generations and future generations. I'm tempted to end with yet another anecdote, but I don't want to. Because I'm running out of time, but also because what I want to say is this is what we have to do. And so we have to be entirely serious that, crazy as it sounds, this is what we are going to do, because it is the only way that we can save hundreds of millions of lives. I'll stop there.